What if everything we think we know about early humanity is not just incomplete, but inverted? The Sumerian tablets present us with a historical paradox that upends the entire narrative of human progress. They reveal an Earth before the Anunnaki that wasn't a blank slate or a brutal struggle, but a finished masterpiece of balanced existence. The shocking truth isn't about what we lacked back then. It's about what we have lost and what was deliberately installed in its place. A warm and curious welcome to you. It's wonderful to have you here as we peel back another layer of this profound mystery. Thank you for lending your imagination to this re-examination of our deepest past. We are taught evolution is a ladder, a slow climb from simplicity to complexity. But the Sumerian vision is of a circle, once perfect, then broken. In the texts, this era is called before the lowering of the kingship from heaven. Humans existed without the very concept of a king. There was no top and bottom, only a wide, flat circle of shared experience. They had no granaries because hunger was unknown. The earth offered its bounty without toil. They had no temples because they felt no separation from the sacred. Every grove and spring was inherently holy. There was no writing because there were no decrees to record, no debts to tally, no wars to memorialize. The shock isn't the absence of civilization. It's the presence of a complete, sustainable, and deeply peaceful alternative. Our purpose tonight is not to romanticize a Stone Age utopia, but to confront the cognitive whiplash of this revelation. The wonder lies in its implication. The advances given by the Anunnaki, monarchy, agriculture, structured labor, were not solutions to our problems. They were the introduction of new categories of problems, alongside new systems to manage them. We didn't climb from chaos to order. We were switched from one kind of order to another, entirely different kind. To step into that lost paradigm, let's first release our modern minds. Feel the complexity of your own life, its ambitions and anxieties. Now let them drain away. In your mind's eye, see a world painted in colors of abundance and calm. People move without hurry. Time is measured not in hours, but in the lengthening of shadows and the ripening of fruit. The only work is the gentle rhythm of tending, gathering, and being. This is not primitive life. This is life in full, unmediated communion with its source. This is the earth not as a resource, but as a mother, and humanity as her secure, unquestioning children. I invite you to listen with a sense of rediscovery, as if you're hearing a forgotten lullaby from the childhood of our species. The atmosphere is one of serene, unself-conscious wholeness. But the Sumerian texts tell us the Anunnaki, from their perspective of cosmic governance, saw this not as perfection, but as unproductive potential. A garden, to them, was something to be divided, planted in rows, and harvested. The shock of our pre-Anunnaki history is the dawning realization that the roots of our modern discontents, alienation from nature, social stratification, existential striving, are not inherent to the human condition. They are the specific outcomes of a divine project to retrofit a perfectly self-sufficient world into something that would serve a higher foreign authority. Let's explore the stunning portrait of the earth that was, before it was taken apart and rebuilt in an image we now call history. Picture the earth 17,000 years ago, when glaciers still gripped the northern world. Where Iraq stretches today beneath relentless sun, a different landscape breathed. The Persian Gulf extended nearly 300 kilometers farther inland than its modern shores. Sea levels stood 120 meters lower than today, exposing continental shelf that would later drown. Between two rivers that didn't yet have names, marshlands sprawled across terrain that geological forces were still shaping, still pressing into form. The Tigris descended from Armenian highlands, carrying sediment scoured from ancient rock. The Euphrates followed a parallel course, slightly slower, bearing its own burden of silt and clay. Together, they deposited roughly 80 cubic kilometers of alluvial material every millennium, building the Mesopotamian plain grain by grain, flood season by flood season. This wasn't sudden creation, but patient accumulation, the kind that measures time in epochs rather than human generations. Climate was shifting. The Younger Dryas period, that sudden cold snap between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, had released its grip. Temperatures climbed. Rainfall patterns reorganized themselves across the Near East. The Fertile Crescent began living up to that name, transforming from sparse grassland into richer territory, where wild grasses grew thick enough to harvest, where gazelles gathered, where possibilities multiplied. Perhaps the people who wandered these regions noticed the change across their lifetimes. Perhaps they told stories about how their grandparents remembered leaner times, harder seasons. The archaeological record shows their responses, settlements growing more permanent, less mobile. At sites like Jarmo in the Zagros foothills, dated to roughly 7,000 BCE, evidence appears of early agriculture, of humans beginning to shape the land rather than simply moving through it. The rivers flooded. Every spring, snowmelt from distant mountains sent water surging across the plain. Unlike the predictable, gentle floods of the Nile, these inundations arrived violent and capricious. Clay deposits from these ancient floods, identified through grain size analysis and stratigraphic dating, reveal chaos more than blessing. The land between the rivers demanded not just adaptation, but engineering, required communities to cooperate on canal construction, levee building, drainage management. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns these early inhabitants were learning to read. The same constellations we know today marked their seasons. Leo rising signaled spring floods. Scorpius announced autumn planting time. The night sky served as calendar, as map, as connection to forces larger than any single human life. Long before cities rose, long before anyone pressed symbols into clay, this landscape was teaching lessons. It rewarded cooperation over isolation. It punished those who ignored its rhythms. It offered abundance to communities willing to work collectively, willing to plan across generations, willing to remember what previous floods had taught. By 6000 BCE, settlements dotted the southern alluvial plain. Eridu, which Sumerian texts would later call the first city, began as a small farming community near the marshes where the rivers approached the sea. The temple that would eventually rise there, dedicated to Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, started as something far humbler, perhaps just a reed structure marking sacred ground. The land was ready. Silt had accumulated deep enough for intensive agriculture. Water channels could be dug and maintained. Communities had grown large enough to support specialization, some farming, some building, some beginning to develop the administrative systems that would eventually require a revolution. The invention of memory made permanent, of thoughts captured in clay, of writing itself. Imagine holding a piece of clay no larger than your palm, still slightly damp from the river. Around 3400 BCE, in the city of Uruk, someone pressed a shaped reed into that clay's surface. Not randomly, deliberately. The wedge-shaped mark represented something specific, carried meaning that could survive beyond the moment of its creation, beyond the lifespan of the person who made it. This wasn't decoration or idle scratching. This was thought made visible, made permanent. The earliest tablets we've recovered, excavated from Uruk's Iana district in the 1920s and 1930s. Record grain deliveries, beer rations, counts of sheep and cattle. One tablet lists 54 dairy cows. Another tracks barley distributed to workers. A third catalogs temple offerings of dates and fish. Nothing mystical or cosmic, just the practical necessities of an expanding urban economy that had grown too complex for human memory alone. Writing emerged from need, not inspiration. Temple administrators in Uruk faced a problem. Their institution controlled vast agricultural estates, employed hundreds of laborers, collected taxes from surrounding settlements, redistributed resources according to ritual calendars and social obligations. Someone needed to remember who owed what, when obligations came due, which fields produced how much yield. The human mind, remarkable as it is, cannot hold thousands of individual transactions with perfect accuracy across seasons and years. So they developed a system. Early pictographs showed recognizable objects. A bull's head for by all cattle, a reed bundle for grain, a vessel for oil. Over centuries, these images simplified into abstract combinations of wedge-shaped impressions. The Sumerian word for to write was sar, which also meant to inscribe and to measure. Writing and measurement were born together, twins emerging from the same administrative necessity. Perhaps the scribes who developed this system understood its magnitude. Perhaps they recognized they were creating something that would outlive empires, that would allow voices to speak across millennia. More likely, they focused on the immediate task, recording 120 liters of barley, 43 sheep, wages for canal workers. The clay itself proved crucial to preservation. Mesopotamian scribes worked with local alluvial clay, rich in silicates, pressed into tablets while still plastic. These tablets were meant to dry in the sun, creating temporary records that could be recycled when no longer needed. But fire, whether from building destruction, deliberate, archival practices, or urban conflagrations, baked many tablets into ceramic permanence. The same fires that destroyed cities preserved their administrative archives, their literary works, their letters and legends. Thousands of these baked tablets rest now in museums. The British Museum holds roughly 130,000 cuneiform tablets. The University of Pennsylvania houses 30,000 more from Nippur alone. Each one represents a moment when someone shaped meaning into clay, when human consciousness found a way to extend itself beyond the brain's biological limits. This technology spread. From Uruk, cuneiform writing diffused across Mesopotamia, adapted by Akkadian speakers, refined by Babylonians and Assyrians, borrowed and modified for different languages over 3,000 years. The script itself evolved, simplified, standardized, adapted to new purposes beyond accounting. Literature emerged. Myths were recorded. Kings proclaimed their deeds. Lovers sent letters. Prayers were addressed to gods. And, among those myths and prayers, certain names began appearing with regularity. Anu, Enlil, Enki, divine beings whose actions the text described, whose hierarchies they detailed, whose relationship to humanity they explained. The gods entered the permanent record, their stories no longer dependent solely on oral tradition. The stage was set for memory to accumulate, for stories to layer upon stories, for civilization to develop not just institutions, but a written conversation with itself that could span generations. The scribes wrote in Sumerian, pressing their reeds into clay with practiced precision. They described a cosmos organized like a household, like the temple complexes where they worked. At the top sat An, god of heaven, whose name literally meant sky. Below him ruled Enlil, lord of wind and storm, who separated heaven from earth in the beginning times. Enki, called Ea in later Akkadian texts, governed fresh waters and possessed deep wisdom. Inanna, fierce and complex, embodied love and war in equal measure. These weren't abstract theological concepts, but beings with personalities, relationships, conflicts, desires. The Sumerians understood their gods as powerful, not omnipotent. Deities grew hungry and required offerings. They convened in councils to make decisions. They sometimes disagreed, competed for influence, formed alliances. The texts describe divine frustration, fatigue, even fear. In the Atrahasis epic, composed around 1800 BCE from older oral traditions, the gods complain about the burden of labor, digging irrigation canals, maintaining the cosmic order, performing the backbreaking work of civilization. So, they created humans. According to the myth, the god Enki proposed a solution to divine exhaustion. He instructed the mother goddess Nintu to mix clay with the blood of a slain god, Wee-Ilu, whose name meant he who has intelligence. From this mixture, humanity emerged, not as beloved children or noble experiments, but as workers created to relieve divine labor, to maintain temples, to provide offerings that sustained the gods themselves. This wasn't metaphor to the Sumerians. This was cosmological fact, the explanation for human existence and purpose. Temples weren't built to worship distant abstractions, but to house and feed actual divine residents whose presence could be felt, whose statues received daily meals, whose festivals marked the sacred calendar. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on 7 tablets, describes cosmic violence giving birth to order. Tiamat, the primordial saltwater, wages war against younger gods who disturb her rest. Marduk, champion of the divine assembly, defeats her in single combat, splits her body like a shellfish. From one half, he fashions the dome of heaven. From the other, the foundations of earth. Her tears become the Tigris and Euphrates. Her ribs form mountain ranges. Creation through conquest, through the taming of chaos, through violence, rendered productive. These stories served multiple purposes simultaneously. They explained the world's structure, why rain falls from above, why rivers flow, why seasons cycle. They justified kingship. Rulers claimed descent from gods or divine appointment to maintain earthly order as gods maintained cosmic order. They provided ritual frameworks, reenacting creation myths during New Year festivals, reciting flood stories during drought or deluge, invoking specific deities for specific needs. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest surviving literary narrative, contains a flood account remarkably similar to the biblical Noah story. Utnapishtim, warned by Enki of the god's plan to destroy humanity through deluge, builds a boat according to precise divine specifications. He loads his family, craftsmen, animals. The flood comes. Rain falls for 6 days and 7 nights. All humanity outside the boat perishes. When waters recede, Utnapishtim offers sacrifice. The gods, smelling the sweet savor, gather like flies around the offering. They had grown hungry without human sustenance. This is the context in which the word Anunnaki appears, not as a single dramatic revelation, but scattered through hundreds of texts, ritual hymns, king lists, mythological narratives. Sometimes the term refers to 7 judge gods of the underworld. Sometimes it describes the great gods collectively. Sometimes it appears in lists alongside other divine categories: the Igigi, the great gods, the lesser deities. The tablets don't explain the Anunnaki's origins with systematic clarity. They assume audience familiarity, reference shared cultural knowledge that no longer exists. The term appears first in texts dated to the Old Babylonian period, around 1900 BCE, though the concept clearly predates these written instances. Anunnaki. In Sumerian, the word breaks down into component parts that scholars have analyzed with linguistic precision. Anu refers to the sky god An, supreme deity of the heavenly realm. The suffix naki derives from kai, meaning earth or ground. Between them sits a grammatical particle indicating descent or origin. Most Assyriologists translate the complete term as princely offspring, or those of royal blood, divine beings descended from the primordial sky god. The word never appears alone, never receives lengthy definition in the tablets. Ancient scribes used it the way we might use nobility or council, assuming their audience already understood its meaning, its social and cosmic implications. This creates interpretive challenges. We're reading texts written for people who shared cultural context we can only reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. In the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki appear as divine laborers growing weary of maintaining cosmic order. They dig rivers, clear channels, perform the exhausting work of irrigation on a cosmic scale. After 40 years, or perhaps 3,600 years, depending on how one interprets the cuneiform number system, they rebel. They burn their tools, march to Enlil's gate at night, surround his dwelling. The text describes their complaint. Every single one of us gods declared war. The workload is excessive. It is killing us. This labor dispute among deities leads directly to humanity's creation. Other texts present the Anunnaki as judges of the dead, seated in the underworld beside Ereshkigal, queen of that dark realm. They pronounce fates, determine destinies for souls entering the land of no return. In Inanna's descent to the underworld, the 7 Anunnaki sit in judgment when the goddess enters their territory uninvited. They fix the eye of death upon her, speak the word of wrath, deliver utterance of guilt. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions them differently still. When the gods gather to discuss humanity's destruction through flood, the Anunnaki appear among the divine assembly. Later, when the deluge comes, the Anunnaki carried torches, setting the land ablaze with their radiance. Some scholars interpret this as lightning accompanying the storm. Others suggest ritual torches held during divine council. The exact meaning remains contested, dependent on parallel passages in related texts, on comparative mythology, on educated inference. No ancient Sumerian or Akkadian text describes the Anunnaki arriving from elsewhere. No tablet mentions their journey to Earth, their origin on another world, their construction of spacecraft or technological devices. The gods simply exist within the cosmos, part of its structure from the beginning times, emerging from the same primordial chaos that gave birth to everything. The texts describe divine genealogies instead, cosmic family trees. Namu, the primordial sea, gives birth to An and Ki, heaven and earth. Their union produces Enlil. From Enlil and his consort, Ninlil, come the moon god Nana, the sun god Utu, and Inanna. Each generation of gods performs different functions, occupies different cosmic territories, exercises authority over different natural forces and human endeavors. This is standard ancient Near Eastern theology. Egyptian texts describe similar divine hierarchies. Adam begetting Shu and Tefnut, their children creating Geb and Nut, whose offspring include Osiris and Isis. Greek mythology presents chaos giving birth to Gaia and Uranus, whose union produces the Titans, who in turn parent the Olympians. Divine genealogies explain cosmic structure across cultures. The Anunnaki fit within this pattern, not outside it. Members of the divine family, not visitors from beyond. They perform specific roles. Laborers, judges, witnesses, council members, within a cosmos understood as fundamentally organized, hierarchical, populated by beings more powerful than humans, but still bound by cosmic law. On a December morning in 1849, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard stood in the ruins of ancient Nineveh, examining what appeared to be a massive mound of broken clay. His excavation team had been digging through the palace complex of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal for months, uncovering impressive stone reliefs and carved alabaster panels. But this particular room, labeled Room 41 in Layard's meticulous site notes, contained something different. Thousands upon thousands of clay fragments, many no larger than a human hand, packed the floor to a depth of nearly half a meter. Layard recognized cuneiform writing on many pieces. He ordered careful collection, knowing these fragments represented documents, but uncertain of their content or significance. His workers filled crates with roughly 30,000 clay pieces, which were shipped to the British Museum. There they sat for years, awaiting scholars who could read the wedge-shaped script pressed into their surfaces. Only gradually did translators realize what Layard had found. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, containing copies of texts stretching back over 2,000 years, including Sumerian compositions preserved through Babylonian and Assyrian scribal tradition. Among those fragments were pieces of the Enuma Elish, sections of the Epic of Gilgamesh, portions of the Atrahasis narrative. The tablets arrived in London damaged, incomplete. Ancient fires had baked many into ceramic hardness, preserving them but also fragmenting them during building collapse. Other tablets had deteriorated from moisture, from the weight of debris, from the simple passage of 2,600 years since Ashurbanipal's librarians had shelved them. Modern conservators face puzzles containing thousands of pieces, attempting to match edges worn smooth by time, to identify which fragment belongs to which text. Dating methods provide temporal context for these documents. Stratigraphy, the careful recording of which archaeological layers contained which artifacts, places tablets within chronological sequences. When excavators find a tablet beneath a floor dated to 1800 BCE, through associated pottery styles, they know the tablet precedes that construction. Carbon-14 analysis of organic materials found alongside tablets offers additional dating evidence, though the clay itself cannot be carbon dated. Stylistic analysis of the cuneiform script provides another chronological tool. Sumerian writing evolved recognizably over centuries. Archaic signs from 3200 BCE show clear pictographic origins. Classical Sumerian from 2100 BCE displays standardized wedge combinations. Old Babylonian script from 1900 BCE exhibits different proportions, different sign forms. Trained epigraphers can date undated tablets within a century or two based solely on writing style. The physical tablets measure between 5 and 30 centimeters in their longest dimension. Most fit comfortably in two hands, designed for scribal manipulation, for reading while held at an angle to catch light across the impressed wedges. Some larger tablets, called library tablets, contain extensive literary compositions, Smaller tablets record single transactions, brief letters, magical incantations. Translation remains an imperfect art. Sumerian died as a spoken language around 1800 BCE, though scribes continued writing it as a learned liturgical language for another 1,500 years. No bilingual Rosetta Stone unlocked its grammar. Instead, Akkadian Sumerian lexical lists, ancient dictionaries compiled by scribal schools, provided the initial breakthrough. Even with these aids, many Sumerian words carry uncertain meanings, multiple possible interpretations, contextual ambiguities that scholars debate. When we read that the Anunnaki came down, does this mean descended from heaven, arrived from elsewhere, or simply entered a ritual space? The Sumerian verb ed can mean all three, depending on context. When a text describes gods from the shining place, does this refer to a specific location, a metaphorical quality of divinity, or a scribal flourish? Context helps, but gaps remain. We possess perhaps 5% of the tablets produced in ancient Mesopotamia. The rest dissolved in rain, crumbled in abandoned ruins, lies still buried beneath a rocky farmland and modern cities. In 1976, a Russian-born scholar named Zechariah Sitchin published The 12th Planet, offering a radically different reading of ancient Mesopotamian texts. Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were not mythological deities, but extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, which supposedly orbits our sun in a vast elliptical path every 3,600 years. According to his interpretation, these beings arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago, genetically engineered Homo sapiens by combining their DNA with that of Homo erectus, and created humanity to serve as a labor force mining gold needed for Nibiru's atmosphere. His work gained substantial popular following. The 12th Planet and its sequels sold millions of copies worldwide, translated into dozens of languages, inspiring television documentaries, online forums, and entire subcultures dedicated to exploring ancient astronaut theories. Sitchin claimed to have translated Sumerian texts himself, though he held no academic credentials in Assyriology, Sumerian linguistics, or ancient Near Eastern studies. Professional scholars responded with detailed critiques. Dr. Michael Heiser, who held a Ph.D. in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages, published extensive analyses of Sitchin's translations, identifying numerous errors in basic Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. Where Sitchin translated a word as rocket, Assyriologists recognized the standard term for weapon or divine radiance. Where he read orbital paths, the text described destinies or divine decrees. The Sumerian word namtar carries no astronomical connotations in any known context. The University of Pennsylvania's cuneiform collections include no references to a planet Nibiru in the astronomical sense Sitchin described. Sumerian astronomical texts identify 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They tracked lunar cycles with precision, recorded planetary positions, developed sophisticated calendar systems. They never mentioned an additional planet with a 3,600-year orbit. So why did alternative interpretations resonate so powerfully? Perhaps they offered answers to fundamental questions mainstream archaeology leaves open. How did ancient peoples achieve such sophisticated astronomical knowledge? Why do creation myths worldwide share similar patterns? What explains the apparent technological precision of megalithic architecture? Alternative readings provided comprehensive narratives where academic scholarship offered careful uncertainty, acknowledged gaps, competing theories without definitive resolution. The intellectual climate of the 1970s also shaped reception. Post-Apollo moon landings, space exploration seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence gained scientific credibility through projects like SETI. Ancient Imtitsel. Astronaut theories aligned with a space-age reimagining of human origins, suggesting our ancestors received outside assistance, that we were never truly alone in the cosmos. Mainstream Assyriology maintained its position based on linguistic evidence. The text Sitchin cited, describing Marduk creating Earth from Tiamat's body, appears in the Enuma Elish, but Tiamat represents the primordial saltwater ocean, not a planet. The Akkadian word Tiamtu means sea or ocean in every other context where it appears. Marduk's weapon, the Abubu, translates as flood or deluge, not spacecraft. The entire narrative follows standard ancient Near Eastern creation mythology patterns. Order emerging from chaos through divine combat. Academic journals published rebuttals, point-by-point analyses, linguistic corrections. Yet these critiques rarely reached audiences already convinced by alternative narratives. The two interpretive communities spoke past each other, operating from different epistemological frameworks, different assumptions about what ancient texts could mean, different standards for evaluating evidence. What remains undisputed is the physical reality of the tablets themselves. Clay impressed with wedge-shaped marks, describing gods who created humans, sent floods, established kingship, received offerings. The Anunnaki appear in these texts, perform specific functions, exist within complex divine hierarchies. Whether readers interpret these passages as mythology, history, or something stranger, depends on frameworks they bring to the reading, on what they believe possible, on how they understand the relationship between ancient testimony and modern truth. Open the Enuma Elish to Tablet 4, where Marduk prepares to face Tiamat in cosmic combat. The text describes his weapons with careful specificity. He fashioned a bow and set it as his weapon. He mounted an arrow and fixed the bowstring. He grasped the mace in his right hand. The bow and quiver hung at his side. Lightning he set before his face. With blazing flame he filled his body. These aren't vague divine powers, but enumerated implements, listed with the precision of an inventory, described as a warrior might catalog his arsenal before battle. When Marduk defeats Tiamat, the text continues with anatomical detail. He split her body like a shellfish into two parts. Half of her he set up as a covering for the heavens. He stretched out a skin and appointed guards, commanding them not to let her waters escape. The Akkadian verb salalu here means to stretch or to spread out, the same word used for stretching leather or spreading fabric. This is craftsmanship vocabulary applied to cosmic creation, divine action described through familiar material processes. The Atrahasis epic opens with similar concrete imagery. When the gods divided the cosmos, Anu took the heavens for his domain. Enlil took the earth. Enki received the Apsu, the underground freshwater ocean beneath the world's foundations. The text specifies that the Anunnaki descended to earth, that they dug the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, worked to create irrigation channels. The Sumerian word bala appears repeatedly, meaning to dig or to excavate, exactly the term used in administrative texts describing human canal construction. After 40 years, some texts say 3,600 years, depending on numerical interpretation, the divine laborers rebelled. They burned their tools. They marched to Enlil's gate in the night. The text records their complaint. The toil was heavy. the distress too much. Enlil initially responds with anger, considers using force to suppress the rebellion. But Enki proposes an alternative solution, one that would change everything. Create a worker, Enki suggests, who can bear the yoke of the gods. The birth goddess Nintu agrees to participate. She pinches off 14 pieces of clay. She mixes them with the flesh and blood of Wei-Ilu, a god slaughtered for this purpose. The text describes her process with step-by-step precision. She recites an incantation. She places the clay in a mold. After 10 months, like a human pregnancy, the first people emerge. These humans receive specific instructions regarding their purpose. They will maintain the irrigation canals the gods no longer wish to dig. They will cultivate the fields. They will provide offerings, bread, beer, meat, dates, to sustain divine households. The relationship isn't framed as loving parent to child, but employer to employee, divine estate manager to workforce. Humans exist to perform labor, to free the gods from physical toil. The texts never describe this as genetic engineering in the modern sense. No laboratories appear, no microscopes, no DNA splicing technology. The methodology is magical, ritualistic, involving clay and blood and incantation, the tools of Mesopotamian religion, not science fiction. Literary context matters here. Similar creation through mixing narratives appear throughout the ancient Near East. Egyptian texts describe the god Khnum forming humans on a potter's wheel. Greek mythology presents Prometheus shaping humanity from clay. These aren't independent accounts of the same historical event, but parallel expressions of a common ancient question. Where did we come from, and why do we exist? The Sumerian answer emphasized obligation, service, the maintenance of cosmic order through human labor. This reflected their social reality, where temple complexes employed thousands, where kings claimed divine appointment, where the boundary between sacred and secular administration blurred into single integrated system. Something deeper runs beneath these creation accounts, though. Something about memory and meaning that the tablets preserve even as they puzzle. The oldest surviving flood narrative comes from a tablet fragment discovered at Nippur in 1893, dated to approximately 1600 BCE. It tells the story of Ziusudra, a pious king who receives warning from the god Enki of the other gods' plan to destroy humanity through deluge. The text breaks off at crucial moments, damaged, fragmentary, maddeningly incomplete. But enough remains to reconstruct the essential narrative. Build a boat, Enki instructs. Save yourself and representatives of living things. A storm will come such as the world has never known. The most complete version appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the story, Utnapishtim tells to the grief-stricken hero. Utnapishtim describes receiving similar divine warning. He built a boat according to precise specifications, 120 cubits in height and width, roughly 60 meters, a perfect cube floating on the waters. 7 days he loaded it with gold, silver, living creatures of every kind, his family, the craftsmen of the city. On the 7th day, the flood arrived. The text describes the storm with vivid sensory detail. The south wind blew, submerging the mountains. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind, the deluge, the storm overwhelmed the land. Sea and land became indistinguishable. Humanity turned to clay. The surface of the water became level like a roof. Even the gods grew terrified of what they had unleashed. The Anunnaki, gathered in council, wept at the destruction, sat in lamentation, their lips pressed tight with fear. Archaeological evidence suggests major flooding events did occur in ancient Mesopotamia. Excavations at Ur, conducted by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, uncovered a 3.5-meter layer of water-deposited clay, separating earlier occupation levels from later ones, dated to approximately 2900 BCE. Similar flood deposits appear at Uruk, Kish, and Shuruppak, not all from the same period, suggesting multiple regional disasters rather than a single global event. These floods would have been catastrophic for river valley civilizations. Imagine living in a mud brick city on the Mesopotamian plain, when rainfall upstream increases suddenly, when snowmelt from the Zagros Mountains arrives in unprecedented volume. The Tigris and Euphrates, lacking the deep channels and stable banks of the Nile, spread across flat terrain with devastating speed. Water rises 2 meters overnight, then 3, then 5. Homes dissolve, grain stores spoil, livestock drown. Survivors cling to rooftops or flee to higher ground, watching their world vanish beneath muddy water. For people whose entire universe measured perhaps 100 kilometers across, whose geographical knowledge extended only to neighboring cities, such a flood would indeed seem to cover the earth, to destroy all humanity except those who escaped. Memory of actual disaster passed through generations of oral tradition could easily amplify into cosmic catastrophe, local event becoming universal judgment. When the flood in Gilgamesh finally subsides, Utnapishtim's boat grounds on Mount Naimush. He releases a dove, which finds no resting place and returns. He sends a swallow, which also returns. Finally, he releases a raven, which finds carrion, feeds, and does not return. Utnapishtim knows the waters have receded enough. He opens the boat, offers sacrifice. The gods, who had grown hungry without human offerings during the flood, smell the sweet savor and gather around like flies. The parallel to the biblical Noah account is unmistakable. Both feature a righteous man warned by deity. Both describe boat construction to specific divine specifications. Both send birds to test for dry land. Both conclude with sacrifice and divine promise. The Mesopotamian versions predate Hebrew scripture by over 1,000 years, suggesting the direction of influence, showing how stories traveled along trade routes and through cultural contact. But notice what the Sumerian texts emphasize: the gods' dependence on human offerings, their regret at losing their workforce, their hunger during the disaster. These aren't transcendent beings, but entities bound within the cosmos's economic structure. The Sumerian king list presents a chronological puzzle that has fascinated and frustrated scholars for over a century. Carved on clay prisms and tablets from various sites, the text begins with a remarkable statement. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. It then proceeds to list rulers who reigned before the Great Flood, attributing to them reign lengths that seem to defy human biology. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar, his successor, held power for 36,000 years. 8 antediluvian kings in total, with combined reigns totaling 241,200 years. After the flood, the text continues, kingship descended again from heaven. Post-Diluvian reigns shrink gradually but remain superhuman for several dynasties. The first king of Kish after the flood ruled 1,200 years. His successor managed only 960 years. Slowly, across generations, the reign lengths decrease toward plausible human lifespans, reaching historically verifiable figures around 2600 BCE, when the king list begins, to align with archaeological evidence and contemporary records. How should we read these numbers? Some scholars propose scribal errors, suggesting that different numerical systems got confused during copying. The Sumerians used both sexagesimal, base 60, and decimal notation, creating potential for misinterpretation across millennia of manuscript transmission. Others suggest the numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals, or that they encode astronomical cycles, mathematical concepts, or theological principles we no longer understand. The pattern appears in other ancient chronologies as well. Egyptian king lists attribute impossibly long reigns to pre-dynastic rulers. Hindu texts describe yugas, cosmic ages lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Chinese chronicles record sage kings ruling for centuries. Across cultures separated by thousands of kilometers, this same impulse appears to extend sacred time beyond ordinary human measure, to create continuity between cosmic origins and historical present. Perhaps these exaggerated chronologies served political functions. By claiming descent from kings who ruled before the flood, later dynasties legitimized their authority through connection to primordial times. The deeper one's lineage extended into the past, the more cosmic one's claim to power. Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BCE, traced his authority back through the king list to antediluvian rulers, to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven to Eridu. The archaeological record tells a different story. The earliest evidence of urban settlement at Eridu dates to approximately 5,400 BCE, impressive antiquity, but 236,000 years short of the king list's claimed timeline. Pottery sequences, architectural stratigraphy, and carbon-14 dating place the emergence of Sumerian civilization between 4,500 to 3,100 BCE, during the Uruk period when writing developed, when cylinder seals first appeared, when temple complexes grew into city-states. So we face a gap between mythic time and historical time, between what the texts claim and what the earth reveals. This gap exists in every ancient culture. Genesis describes creation occurring roughly 6,000 years ago based on genealogical calculations, while geology demonstrates an Earth 4.5 billion years old. The disconnect isn't evidence of ancient knowledge suppressed by modern science, but rather shows how different cultures conceptualize time, how they use chronology to establish meaning, rather than record objective duration. The Sumerians understood cyclical time differently than we experience linear time. Sacred time didn't flow progressively from past to future, but circled eternally through ritual reenactment. Each New Year festival wasn't just a commemoration of creation, but an actual repetition of it, collapsing the distance between then and now. The king list participates in this cyclical understanding, connecting each contemporary ruler to the original moment when divine kingship first touched earth. What matters isn't whether Ululim actually ruled 28,800 years, but what that number meant to people who wrote it, copied it, preserved it through centuries. What cosmic truth they believed it encoded, what continuity it established between heaven and earth, between divine origin and human present. Sumerian texts describe Dilmun as a place of pristine perfection, a sacred realm where suffering did not exist. In Dilmun, the raven utters no cry, the lion kills not, the wolf seizes not the lamb, unknown is the grain-devouring boar, the dove droops not its head, the sick-eyed one says not, I am sick-eyed, the sick-headed one says not, I am sick-headed. This litany of negations, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, defines paradise through absence of predation, disease, death. Dilmun may have corresponded to a real geographical location. Most scholars identify it with the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, roughly 400 kilometers southeast of ancient Sumer. Archaeological excavations there have revealed extensive Bronze Age settlements, burial mounds containing thousands of graves, evidence of trade connections with Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and East Africa. Cuneiform tablets from Ur's commercial archives record ships departing for Dilmun, carrying textiles and grain, returning with copper, precious stones, and exotic woods. But Dilmun in mythology transcends any earthly location. It serves as the primordial garden, the place where creation first achieved perfect form. Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, dwells there with his consort Ninhursag. The text describes how he brings sweet water to the land, how he fills it with abundance. At his command, water rises from underground springs. Date palms grow without being planted. Fields produce grain without cultivation. This is agricultural fantasy made divine reality, the dream of every Mesopotamian farmer who struggled against flood, drought, salt, accumulation, crop failure. The gods inhabit architectural spaces that mirror human temple complexes. Texts describe divine dwellings with detailed precision. Enlil's temple in Nippur, called Ikur, meaning mountain house, served as his earthly residence, the point where heaven touched earth. Excavations at Nippur have uncovered this temple's foundations, revealing successive building phases stretching back to approximately 5000 BCE. Each generation expanded, rebuilt, elevated the structure, creating an artificial mountain rising from the flat alluvial plain. Ziggurats embodied this mountain symbolism most dramatically. The ziggurat at Ur, built by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, originally stood roughly 30 meters high, with a base measuring 64 by 46 meters. 3 staircases, 2 flanking, 1 frontal, led to the summit platform where the god's shrine resided. The structure wasn't solid, but contained a mud brick core supported by baked brick facing, with drainage systems to prevent water damage, with weeper holes to release moisture, showing sophisticated engineering applied to sacred architecture. Imagine standing at the ziggurat's base on a summer morning. The sun already fierce at 8 a.m., temperature climbing toward 45 degrees Celsius. You begin ascending the northeastern staircase, each step measuring approximately 20 centimeters high. Your feet press against baked bricks still cool from night. As you climb, the city spreads below, mud brick homes, narrow streets, the curved line of the Euphrates glinting in morning light. At the summit, perhaps 150 steps later, wind moves more freely, carrying scents from the marshes. The summit shrine itself remained small, intimate rather than grand. Only priests entered, performing daily rituals, washing the god's statue, dressing it in fresh linens, presenting meals of bread, beer, dates, roasted meat. The deity resided there not metaphorically, but actually present in the statue, requiring care, needing sustenance. Temple accounts meticulously recorded these daily offerings, thousands of tablets cataloging what Nana the moon god consumed, what Inanna received, what Enlil required. Sacred groves surrounded temple complexes, gardens planted with date palms, tamarisks, poplars. Water features, pools and channels fed by the rivers, created oases of green in the brown landscape. These weren't purely decorative, but cosmologically significant, earthly reflections of divine Dilmun, attempts to recreate paradise within the human realm. The boundary between divine and human space remained permeable, maintained through ritual, through offering, through architecture that lifted human hands toward heaven while anchoring divine presence to earth. Hidden within administrative texts and astronomical diaries lies evidence of sophisticated celestial observation. The Venus tablet of Amisataka, dated to the reign of a Babylonian king around 1646 BCE, records the planet's appearances and disappearances over a 21-year period with remarkable precision. The tablet notes that in the month of Nisanu, on the 15th day, Venus disappeared in the east. For 3 days it stayed away from the sky. On the 18th day, Venus appeared in the west. These observations weren't casual, but systematic, part of a tradition stretching back centuries before this particular scribe pressed reed to clay. Sumerian astronomers developed the sexagesimal mathematical system we still use today for measuring time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in a degree, 360 degrees in a circle. These divisions descend directly from Mesopotamian mathematics. Why base 60? Perhaps because 60 divides cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making calculations and fractions simpler in an era before decimal notation. Perhaps for deeper astronomical reasons we no longer fully understand, relating to Jupiter's 12-year cycle or Saturn's 30-year orbit. The Mul-Apen tablets, compiled around 1000 BCE from earlier observations, catalog over 60 stars and constellations. They describe heliacal risings, the moment when a star first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before dawn. They record which stars cross the meridian simultaneously. They note that when Sirius rises, the weather grows hot, and when the Pleiades set, winter begins. These weren't mystical pronouncements, but practical agricultural calendars tied to observable celestial events. Yet nowhere in surviving Sumerian astronomical texts do we find mention of Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, planets invisible to the naked eye. The Mesopotamian astronomical canon recognized 5 wandering stars: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, along with the Sun and Moon, 7 celestial bodies whose movements could be tracked without optical instruments. Modern claims that Sumerians knew of outer planets rest on misinterpretation of texts describing divine councils, or mythological cosmology, rather than observational astronomy. The mul.apin text do describe something called Nibiru, but its meaning differs from popular interpretation. In context, Nibiru appears as a title for Jupiter, or sometimes Marduk's celestial manifestation, marking the crossing point of the ecliptic. The Akkadian verb eberu means to cross, or to pass over, and Nibiru likely designated the point where Jupiter's path intersected other planetary orbits. No ancient text describes Nibiru as a 12th planet, with a 3,600-year elliptical orbit. No astronomical diary records its periodic return. What Sumerian astronomers did achieve remains impressive without embellishment. They developed predictive models for lunar eclipses, calculating when Earth's shadow would fall across the moon based on cycle patterns observed over generations. They tracked planetary retrograde motion, those moments when Mars or Jupiter appeared to reverse direction against the background stars. They correlated celestial events with terrestrial outcomes, creating omen series that connected astronomical observations to political forecasting. The boundary between astronomy and astrology didn't exist in ancient thought. Observing the heavens served practical purposes, determining when to plant crops, when to expect floods, when to conduct royal rituals. The gods communicated through celestial signs, and priests trained for years to read that divine language written in stellar motion. Perhaps the sophistication of Mesopotamian astronomy suggests something beyond simple agricultural necessity. Perhaps it hints at deeper curiosity about the cosmos, about humanity's place within vast cycles of time and space. Or perhaps it simply demonstrates what patient observation can achieve. Generations of priests recording nightly movements, comparing notes, finding patterns that persisted through decades and centuries. The clay tablets holding this knowledge rest now in climate-controlled museum storage, their cuneiform markings still crisp after 4 millennia, still testifying to the careful watching, the systematic recording, the accumulated wisdom of those who studied stars with nothing but naked eyes and unlimited patience. Beneath the mythological narrative of divine labor and human creation lies a puzzle about gold and its meaning. The Atrahasis epic describes Anunnaki gods laboring in hard conditions, digging canals and bearing the load until rebellion forces a solution: the creation of humanity to assume their burden. Some interpretations suggest this labor involved gold mining, that humans were engineered specifically to extract this metal from the earth. Yet when we examine Sumerian economic texts and archaeological evidence, a different picture emerges. Gold appears rarely in early Sumerian contexts compared to silver, copper, and bronze. Temple inventories from Ur III period, 2112 to 2004 BCE, list precious metals by weight. Silver dominates these records, serving as the primary standard of value for trade and taxation. Gold appears occasionally in ritual contexts, offerings to deities, royal jewelry, decorative temple furnishings, but not in quantities suggesting large-scale mining operations. Archaeological excavations have uncovered gold artifacts, certainly, but they're exceptional rather than common finds. The primary metal extracted in ancient Mesopotamia was copper, mined in the Zagros Mountains and imported from Oman. Cuneiform texts record copper in ton quantities, shipped by boat from Dilmun, processed in urban workshops, cast into tools and weapons. Bronze production, copper alloyed with tin, drove technological advancement, enabling harder tools, more effective agriculture, military advantage. If the texts describe divine interest in extracted minerals, copper seems the more economically significant candidate. Where did Sumerian gold actually come from? Trade routes connected Mesopotamia to gold sources in Anatolia, Egypt, and possibly the Indus Valley. Temple accounts record gold arriving as tribute, as payment for grain and textiles, through exchange rather than local mining. The metal's rarity enhanced its ritual value, making it appropriate for divine statues and royal regalia, but there's no evidence of the massive extraction operations that ancient astronaut theories propose. The digging, described in Atrahasis, more likely refers to irrigation canal construction. This labor consumed enormous collective effort in ancient Mesopotamia. Canals needed constant maintenance, clearing silt deposits, repairing breaches, extending networks to newly cultivated land. Administrative texts from cities like Lagash and Umma record labor gangs, sometimes thousands of workers, deployed for canal projects. One text describes 1,500 workers digging a canal measuring 23 kilometers long, completing the project in less than a month. Perhaps the myth reflects social memory of this exhausting, never-ending work. Imagine the reality behind the metaphor. Dawn, breaking over the plain, men gathering with bronze tools and reed baskets, descending into muddy channels under a supervisor's direction. The work continues through brutal heat. muscles straining against sticky clay, backs bent in repetitive labor. At day's end, perhaps 5 meters of canal cleared, widened, deepened. Tomorrow the same. Next month the same. The canal itself serving divine purposes, bringing water that sustains crops that feed temple populations, that support priests who maintain cosmic order. The texts don't describe technological mining operations, but agricultural infrastructure. They speak of baskets carried, of earth moved, of rivers channeled. Precisely the activities that archaeological evidence confirms consumed massive human labor. The myth doesn't hide advanced technology, but explains why such grueling work became humanity's defining obligation. We exist, the story says, to maintain the systems that feed civilization, to perform the labor that gods themselves found unbearable. Modern reinterpretation adds layers the original texts don't contain. The Sumerian word for dig is simply dig. The word for labor means labor. The gods' complaint about hard work reflects the genuine physical reality of canal maintenance, not coded reference to gold extraction or genetic engineering. Still, questions persist. Why did Sumerians conceive of gods growing weary? Why frame human purpose through obligation rather than love? Perhaps these themes reveal something true about their lived experience. The relentless demands of agricultural civilization, the transformation from hunter-gatherer flexibility to settled hierarchical society bound by seasonal imperatives and collective projects. The answers remain partially hidden beneath layers of time and translation. Rolled across wet clay, a cylinder seal leaves behind an image that has sparked considerable modern debate. The artifact known as VA-243 resides in Berlin's Vorderasiatisches Museum, catalogued among thousands of Mesopotamian cylinder seals. Carved in the Akkadian period around 2400 BCE, it measures 4.4 centimeters high and 2.5 centimeters in diameter. The carved scene shows two seated figures, likely a deity and a worshipper, flanked by standing attendants. Above them appear stars or celestial symbols, arranged in a pattern that some interpret as our solar system. Alternative researchers point to what they identify as a sun symbol surrounded by 11 smaller spheres, suggesting knowledge of planets beyond those visible to the naked eye. They propose this represents our complete solar system, including Nibiru as a 12th planet. Mainstream archaeologists read the same image differently, as stylized stars, indicating the divine or cosmic nature of the scene, following standard iconographic conventions, appearing across hundreds of similar seals. The challenge lies in determining what symbols meant to their creators. Cylinder seal iconography follows established patterns. Stars indicate divinity or celestial realms. Raised hands show worship or supplication. Animals represent specific deities, the bull for Enlil, the lion for Ishtar, the goatfish for Enki. These weren't realistic depictions, but symbolic vocabulary, compressed visual language, communicating mythological or ritual content within the seal's tiny carved surface. When we examine VA-243 alongside contemporary seals, its imagery appears conventional rather than exceptional. Other seals from the same period show similar celestial symbols, stars, crescents, solar disks, arranged around divine figures. The planets alternative researchers identify might represent stars in general, deities in the divine council, or decorative elements filling negative space. Without accompanying text explaining the specific meaning, interpretation depends on comparative analysis across thousands of similar artifacts. Seal manufacturing itself demonstrates sophisticated artisan skill, working within technological constraints. Craftsmen carved these miniature scenes into semi-precious stones, lapis lazuli, carnelian, hematite, using copper drills and abrasive powders. The finest seals display extraordinary detail despite their small scale. Individual fingers on hands, distinct facial features, elaborate garment patterns. Yet this same precision makes clear what the technology could and couldn't achieve. Geometric patterns appear crisp and exact. Organic forms show stylization rather than naturalistic accuracy. The question becomes not whether the seal shows planets, but whether its creators conceived of planets as we do. Mesopotamian cosmology divided the universe into heaven, earth, and underworld. The stars belong to heaven's realm, home of the gods. 5 wandering stars received special attention because they moved against the fixed stellar background. But astronomical knowledge, impressive as it was, didn't extend to heliocentric models, didn't recognize planets as worlds similar to Earth, didn't detect outer planets invisible to naked observation. Perhaps we see in cylinder seals what we expect to find, projecting modern knowledge onto ancient symbols. This isn't unique to alternative researchers. Academic interpretations also carry assumptions shaped by contemporary frameworks, by what seems reasonable given current understanding of Mesopotamian culture. The difference lies in methodology, whether interpretations align with broader archaeological context, whether they fit linguistic evidence, whether they remain consistent with what we know from thousands of related artifacts. The seals themselves remain ambiguous, open to multiple readings. They were never meant to communicate across 4 millennia to audiences unfamiliar with Mesopotamian religious iconography. They served immediate purposes, authenticating documents, marking property, identifying owners, invoking divine protection. The visual language assumed shared cultural knowledge that we can only partially reconstruct. So, VA 243 keeps its secrets, or perhaps reveals them to anyone willing to invest years studying comparative iconography, learning to read visual symbols within their original context. The mystery isn't whether the seal encodes hidden astronomical knowledge, but whether we can set aside our modern assumptions long enough to perceive what ancient eyes saw when they pressed this carved stone into clay, leaving behind an image that would long outlive the empire that created it. The question that separates interpretations often comes down to a single word, a single cuneiform sign that could mean multiple things. Take the Sumerian word dingir, represented by a star-shaped symbol. In most contexts, scholars translate it as God or divine being, but the sign also appears as a determinative, a marker indicating the word following. It relates to the heavenly or sacred realm. Some alternative researchers suggest dingir originally meant bright ones or shining ones, proposing this describes physical beings from the sky rather than supernatural deities. Mainstream Assyriologists respond that the word's usage across thousands of texts consistently indicates divine status, not literal brightness. Academic Sumerology operates within strict methodological frameworks developed over 170 years of scholarship. Universities like Pennsylvania, Chicago, Yale, and Oxford train specialists in Sumerian grammar, comparative Semitic linguistics, archaeological context, and cuneiform paleography. Students spend years learning to read original tablets, studying grammatical particles, memorizing sign values that changed across centuries. This training emphasizes peer review, requires translations to align with broader textual evidence, demands that interpretations fit archaeological findings. Alternative researchers often work outside these institutional structures, approaching texts with different assumptions about their purpose. If one begins with the hypothesis that ancient civilizations received extraterrestrial contact, then certain passages seem to support that view. The Akkadian word shamu means sky or heaven, but could also mean that which is above, possibly referring to space beyond Earth's atmosphere. The verb warad means to descend, but descent from where? From heaven in a theological sense, or from somewhere more literal. Context usually clarifies meaning, but ambiguity genuinely exists in fragmentary texts. When the Atrahasis epic describes the Anunnaki mixing clay with divine blood to create humans, what exactly occurred? Mainstream scholarship interprets this as mythological metaphor for divine involvement in human origins, comparable to Greek myths of Prometheus shaping humanity from clay. Alternative readings suggest genetic engineering, arguing that blood could represent DNA, that mixing describes biological manipulation rather than supernatural creation. The challenge becomes distinguishing between what the text actually says and what we think it means. Ancient writers assumed their audiences shared cultural context. We lack. They didn't explain basic cosmological concepts because everyone already understood them. We're reading texts across a vast gulf. 4,000 years, dead languages, vanished civilizations, worldviews fundamentally alien to modern secular materialism. Both mainstream and alternative interpretations bridge that gulf using different assumptions. Some translation disputes focus on proper names and their meanings. The name Anunnaki itself generates debate. Does it mean princely offspring? Those who from heaven to earth came? Or those of the royal seed? Each translation carries implications. Princely offspring suggests divine genealogy within Mesopotamian pantheon. Those who from heaven to earth came implies arrival from elsewhere. The Sumerian grammatical structure allows multiple readings depending on how one breaks down the word. Components. Perhaps the most honest position acknowledges translation's inherent uncertainty while respecting evidence-based methodology. We genuinely don't know what Sumerian sounded like when spoken. The language died 4,000 years ago. We reconstruct pronunciation from Akkadian bilingual texts, from spelling patterns, from comparative linguistics. We can be confident about many translations, uncertain about others, completely puzzled by some words appearing only once in surviving texts. What separates careful scholarship from speculative interpretation isn't certainty, but methodology. How rigorously one checks translations against parallel passages. How thoroughly one examines archaeological context. How honestly one acknowledges gaps in knowledge. Both approaches seek truth, but they weigh different kinds of evidence, trust different authorities, arrive at incompatible conclusions. The tablets themselves remain neutral, their cuneiform wedges recording whatever their ancient creators intended. We bring our frameworks to the reading, our assumptions about what's possible, our beliefs about human history and cosmic possibilities. The text doesn't change, but what we see in it does, shaped by the questions we bring, the answers we expect, the worldview we inhabit. Perhaps both mainstream and alternative readings reveal something true, not about ancient Mesopotamia necessarily, but about our persistent human need for meaning, for connection to something larger than ourselves, for stories that explain where we came from and why we're here. Stand back far enough, and patterns emerge across cultures that never contacted each other, separated by oceans and millennia. Flood narratives appear in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Norse, and numerous indigenous American traditions. The details vary. Sometimes the hero builds a boat, sometimes he climbs a mountain, sometimes a goddess warns him. But the core structure persists. Catastrophic deluge. Divine. Warning. Survival of the righteous. Renewal of the world. Either these stories record independent cultural memories of local disasters, or they reflect something deeper about human psychology and environmental experience. Creation through cosmic conflict appears across distant mythologies with striking similarity. Mesopotamian Marduk defeats Tiamat, splitting her body to form heaven and earth. Norse Odin slays the primordial giant Ymir, fashioning the world from his corpse. Hindu Indra conquers the drought serpent Vritra, releasing waters that nourish creation. Egyptian Ra battles the chaos serpent Apep nightly to preserve cosmic order. These aren't vague resonances, but detailed structural parallels. Order emerging from chaos, younger gods defeating primordial forces, creation requiring violence. Some researchers propose these similarities indicate common ancient source, perhaps a lost civilization that predates known history. If a technologically advanced culture existed before the flood, they argue, and survivors carried its knowledge to different regions, that would explain why myths worldwide share core narratives. This hypothesis appeals to those seeking unified explanations for apparent historical mysteries. How ancient peoples move massive stones. Why pyramids appear on different continents. Why astronomical alignments recur in separated cultures. Mainstream archaeology offers different explanations for cross-cultural patterns. Similar myths might arise from similar human experiences and psychological structures. All agricultural societies face flooding risks, making deluge narratives psychologically resonant. All cultures observe the sky, notice celestial patterns, develop astronomical frameworks. All hierarchical societies need origin stories justifying their social structures. Convergent cultural evolution could produce similar myths without requiring direct contact or common source. The concept of divine human hybrids appears remarkably widespread. Greek heroes like Hercules and Perseus claimed gods as fathers. Egyptian pharaohs declared themselves offspring of Ra or Horus. Hindu epics describe avatars, divine beings taking physical form. Sumerian king lists attribute superhuman reigns to early rulers, blurring the boundary between mortal and divine. Either this pattern reflects historical reality, beings of superior power actually interbreeding with humans, or it represents a universal human impulse to connect earthly authority with cosmic legitimacy. Perhaps both explanations hold partial truth without contradicting each other. Ancient peoples may have experienced local floods, then shaped those memories into cosmic narratives serving cultural needs. They may have observed celestial phenomena, then woven astronomical knowledge into mythological frameworks explaining divine action. They may have created hybrid beings in their stories to explore questions about human nature, mortality, the relationship between earthly and sacred realms. The fact that we find the same questions emerging across cultures — where did we come from? Why do we suffer? What happens when we die? Why do stars move in predictable patterns? — suggests these concerns arise from the human condition itself. We're meaning-making creatures, pattern-seeking minds trying to understand our place in a vast, often incomprehensible cosmos. Our ancestors faced the same existential questions we face, with less scientific knowledge but equal intelligence, equal need for answers. They constructed explanatory frameworks using the conceptual tools available: gods, heroes, cosmic struggles, divine genealogies. Whether those frameworks describe literal historical events or psychological truths expressed through metaphor remains contested. Perhaps this is a false dichotomy. Perhaps myth operates on multiple levels simultaneously, preserving cultural memory, encoding astronomical knowledge, expressing philosophical insight, justifying social structures, exploring existential questions, and simply telling compelling stories that bind communities across generations. The persistence of these narratives across millennia, their survival through cultural upheavals and technological revolutions, suggests they serve fundamental human needs that transcend specific theological or scientific frameworks. We still tell stories about our origins, still debate whether we're alone in the universe, still wonder if something greater than ourselves shaped our existence. The questions the Anunnaki texts raised 4,000 years ago remain essentially unchanged, even as our methods for investigating them have transformed beyond anything those ancient scribes could have imagined. The tablets lay buried for over 2,000 years before anyone could read them again. When cuneiform fell out of use around the 1st century CE, replaced by alphabetic scripts, the knowledge of how to read those wedge-shaped impressions vanished. Travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries encountered ruins throughout Iraq and Iran, noticed strange markings on stone and clay, but couldn't decipher their meaning. The wedges looked decorative, perhaps ornamental, rather than linguistic. The idea that these represented one of humanity's first writing systems remained beyond imagination. The breakthrough came gradually through the 19th century, driven by patient comparison of inscriptions at multiple sites. Georg Friedrich Grotefend made initial progress in 1802, working with Old Persian cuneiform inscriptions that mentioned recognizable royal names. Henry Rawlinson built on this foundation in the 1840s, copying the massive Behistun inscription carved on a cliff face in Iran. The same text written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. By comparing these parallel versions, scholars slowly unlocked cuneiform secrets, moving backward through time from Persian to Akkadian to Sumerian. Even now, new tablets emerge from museum storage, previously uncatalogued or misidentified. The British Museum alone holds tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets never fully translated or published. University collections contain clay fragments awaiting specialists who can read them. Iraqi archaeologists continue excavating sites interrupted by decades of conflict, discovering texts that expand our understanding of Mesopotamian civilization. In 2015, researchers identified previously unknown sections of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Suleymaniye Museum, adding 20 lines to the flood narrative. Digital humanities projects are transforming how scholars work with these ancient texts. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative has photographed over 300,000 tablets, making high-resolution images available to researchers worldwide. Machine learning algorithms help identify damaged signs, match fragmentary tablets, even predict missing portions based on parallel texts. What required years of manual comparison can now happen in hours, allowing new connections to emerge from the vast corpus of Mesopotamian literature. Still today, the name Anunnaki circulates through popular culture, appearing in documentaries, novels, video games, online forums dedicated to ancient mysteries. The texts that preserved their name have traveled from Sumerian clay to Akkadian copies, to Assyrian libraries, to archaeological excavations, to museum collections, to digital databases, to worldwide internet discussions. Each transmission transformed the meaning slightly, added new interpretations, reached audiences the original scribes never anticipated. The story continues evolving, shaped by whoever encounters it. Perhaps this transformation represents the natural life cycle of all mythologies. Ancient Greeks reinterpreted Egyptian gods, identifying Thoth with Hermes, Amun with Zeus. Romans adapted Greek mythology to their own cultural needs. Medieval scholars read classical texts through Christian frameworks. We read ancient Mesopotamian texts through frameworks shaped by science fiction, space exploration, genetic engineering, concepts utterly foreign to the text creators, but impossible for us to completely set aside. The tablets themselves remain unchanged in their climate-controlled cases, still carrying whatever meaning their creators intended. Visitors can see them at the British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The clay feels surprisingly solid when archaeologists handle it with gloved hands during research. Not fragile, but dense, permanent, heavier than its size suggests. The wedges pressed into the surface catch light at angles, becoming visible or disappearing depending on how you turn the tablet. These objects connect us directly to the people who made them. Someone's hands shaped this clay. Someone's mind composed these words. Someone's concerns about gods and floods and human origins pressed meaning into malleable earth that hardened into something lasting enough to survive empires, religions, languages, entire civilizations rising and falling. We are their continuation, their descendants, not necessarily by blood, but by inheritance of questions. We still wonder about our origins, still look to the sky for meaning, still tell stories trying to explain why we exist and what our purpose might be. The Anunnaki texts don't answer these questions definitively, but they remind us that we've been asking them for as long as we've been writing things down, preserving them, hoping someone in an unimaginable future might understand. Let yourself settle now into wherever you're resting. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow through Iraq, still carrying silt from Armenian highlands toward the Persian Gulf, still building land grain by grain as they have for millions of years. The rivers don't know about the cities they once nourished, the temples that drew water from their banks, the scribes who recorded their flood cycles. They simply move as water moves, following gravity, shaping landscape through patient erosion. Stars wheel overhead in the same pattern Sumerian priests observed 4,500 years ago. Leo still rises in spring. Scorpius still marks autumn. The planets still wander their predictable paths against the fixed stellar background. The sky preserves continuity that human civilizations lack. The same night view available to anyone willing to look up, to notice, to wonder why these lights move while others remain stationary. Somewhere in museum storage, clay tablets rest in their numbered boxes, holding their cuneiform impressions in permanent darkness. The tablets don't require reading to continue existing. They survived burial, survived excavation, survived cataloging and transportation and scholarly debate. They'll outlast us too, those fragments of baked clay carrying words about gods who labored and humans who were created and floods that came and kings who ruled impossible lengths of time. Whether the Anunnaki represented literal beings from elsewhere or metaphorical expressions of Mesopotamian theology matters less than the fact that someone cared enough to record the stories, to preserve them through multiple copies, to pass them forward through generations. That impulse to remember, to maintain connection with the past, to ensure knowledge survives beyond individual lifespans, that continues in us. You're lying somewhere tonight, listening to words about ancient texts, participating in the same transmission process that kept these stories alive. Someone speaks, someone listens, memory moves forward. The medium changes, clay to paper to digital audio, but the essential act remains identical. We are still telling each other stories about where we came from, still preserving what seems important, still hoping it matters. Maybe the question isn't whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or metaphors, but why we need origin stories at all. Why humans across every culture and era feel compelled to explain their existence through narratives about beings greater than themselves. Perhaps that need itself reveals something true about us, about consciousness seeking context, about minds trying to position themselves within incomprehensibly vast time and space. The ruins at Eridu still mark where the first city may have begun. Sand has covered much of what remains. Looters have disturbed some areas. Archaeologists have excavated others, carefully recording stratigraphy before backfilling trenches to protect the site. The ziggurat's foundations still anchor that spot where humans first decided permanence mattered more than migration, where they committed to staying, building, recording, remembering. Wind moves across those ruins tonight as it has moved across that landscape since before humans existed there. The wind doesn't distinguish between ancient and modern, between occupied and abandoned. It simply flows around whatever rises from the earth, carrying dust, redistributing particles, gradually smoothing everything toward flatness again. Time continues its patient work, breaking down what was built, burying what remains, preparing layers for future archaeologists who may wonder about us the way we wonder about Sumerians. What will they make of our origin stories, our debates about ancient texts, our attempts to connect with civilizations separated from us by thousands of years? Will they understand our questions, or will they bring entirely new frameworks we can't imagine? The mystery doesn't resolve. It simply continues, held in clay and stone and the movement of stars, waiting for whoever comes next with questions, with wonder, with the distinctly human need to know where we came from and what it might mean. The night holds all of this: the questions, the answers, the unknowing, the peace of accepting that some things remain mysterious, even after millennia of investigation. And that's enough.